The story of Peter of Georgia haunts the shadows of American history, a tale of defiance that unfolded beneath the silver glow of a midnight moon. This forgotten hero transformed his tormentors' own weapons against him, proving that even in chains, the human spirit finds ways to revolt. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The cotton fields of Whitmore Plantation stretched endlessly under the Georgia sun of 1850, their white blooms deceptively beautiful against the rich red soil. To passing travelers on the Savannah Road, they might have seemed peaceful, a testament to Southern prosperity. But those who worked the land knew better. In Chatham County, the Whitmore name was spoken in hushed tones, a place where the crack of whips punctuated dawn prayers, and where hope withered faster than crops in drought. Peter Williams moved through this world like a shadow. Tall and lean, with eyes that missed nothing, he tended the smokehouse with quiet efficiency. The thick, aromatic smoke clung to his clothes and skin, becoming part of him. At 32, Peter had survived longer than many, learning that survival meant becoming invisible while seeing everything. "Keep the fire steady," the plantation manager would bark before disappearing, leaving Peter alone with hanging meat and his thoughts. These solitary hours became his sanctuary. Through the small window of the smokehouse, he observed the daily rhythms of Whitmore, the overseer's morning inspections, the field hand's weary returns at dusk, the changing of guards near the property boundaries. Elias Ford, the plantation overseer, was a man whose reputation preceded him. His voice carried across the fields like thunder, and the slaves learned to predict his moods by the set of his shoulders or the pace of his stride. Peter studied these patterns meticulously, noting how Ford kept his prized bloodhounds kenneled near the eastern fence, how he fed them himself at sundown, how he trained them to track human scent with savage precision. At night, lying on his thin pallet in the crowded cabin, Peter would often hear those hounds baying in the distance. Sometimes they were hunting, a sound that made everyone tense with dread, knowing someone had risked everything for freedom. Other nights, they howled at the moon or distant wildlife, but the message remained the same. Escape was nearly impossible. "You notice too much," Sarah had whispered to him once, catching him watching Ford's training session. Her perceptiveness had startled him, but he'd merely shrugged in response. The smokehouse offered unexpected advantages. Its location near the edge of the main grounds meant Peter could observe the comings and goings of visitors, the rotation of guards, the secret meetings between enslaved people from neighboring plantations. He memorized the weak spots in the perimeter, the times when surveillance slackened, the hiding places overlooked by searchers. Peter survived by understanding that knowledge was power in a place where he was meant to have none. Every detail, the changing seasons, the overseer's habits, the dog's behavior, formed pieces of a puzzle he wasn't yet sure how to use. But he collected them anyway, storing them carefully behind his guarded expression, knowing that someday survival might depend on more than just keeping his head down. Elias Ford strode across the Whitmore plantation like he owned every blade of grass beneath his boots. The overseer's reputation preceded him throughout Chatham County, a man whose very presence made children hide and adults lower their eyes. His voice, rough as broken glass, carried across the cotton fields, and when he spoke, even the birds seemed to fall silent. "You there, pick faster or feel the whip," he bellowed at a woman struggling under the Georgia sun. The worker's back stiffened at his approach, fingers moving more frantically among the cotton bolls. Ford's most feared weapons weren't his whips or pistols, but the 6 bloodhounds that followed him like shadows. The pack lived in kennels near the smokehouse, where Peter Williams could hear their restless movements during his night shifts. These weren't ordinary hunting dogs. They were trained specifically to track human scent, to run down anyone desperate enough to flee toward the promise of freedom. Those hounds can smell fear from 3 miles away. An elder named Jacob had whispered to Peter one evening, "They've brought back 15 runners in the last 2 years alone." The evidence of the dog's efficiency was displayed for all to see. When they returned with a captured runaway, Ford would gather everyone to witness the punishment, a brutal spectacle designed to extinguish hope. The overseer would stand tall, his weathered face showing no emotion as the bloodhounds circled excitedly, their work complete. Yet something curious happened in the aftermath of these demonstrations. While many cowered, others exchanged glances filled with quiet resolve. In the slave quarters, hushed conversations continued long after sunset, voices barely audible above the chirping crickets. Every tyrant plants the seeds of his own destruction, Mama Esther, the oldest woman on the plantation, would say while mending torn clothing. Her gnarled fingers never stopped working as she spoke. The harder the hand presses down, the stronger the spirit beneath it grows. Peter absorbed these words, tucking them away like precious contraband. During his smokehouse duties, he observed Ford's routines, how he commanded the dogs with specific whistles, how he rewarded them with scraps of meat, how the animals responded to different tones. The overseer's predictability became a map in Peter's mind. One evening, as Spanish moss swayed in the humid breeze, Peter watched Ford training the youngest hound, a cinnamon-colored dog named Rufus. The animal seemed more hesitant than the others, earning a kick from his master. Something shifted in Peter that night. He continued stoking the smokehouse fires, his face revealing nothing. But beneath his calm exterior, an idea began to take root. Dangerous, impossible, yet persistent. The bloodhounds might belong to Ford, but loyalty was something that could be earned, and perhaps even stolen. Peter Williams' assignment to the smokehouse came through no grand design, merely a decision made by the plantation manager who needed someone reliable to tend the fires. The smokehouse, a sturdy wooden structure where meat was preserved, sat at the eastern edge of Whitmore Plantation, its chimney releasing thin wisps of smoke day and night. What seemed like an ordinary job soon revealed itself as a strategic position that would change everything. The smokehouse's location proved fortuitous, just 60 yards from the kennels where Elias Ford kept his infamous pack of bloodhounds. These weren't ordinary hunting dogs. They were instruments of terror, trained to track down anyone who dared flee the plantation's boundaries. Most enslaved people avoided the area entirely, the mere sound of barking enough to send shivers down their spines. But Peter saw opportunity where others saw danger. His duties required him to stoke fires late into the night, long after most workers had returned to their cabins. In these quiet hours, when even Ford retired to his quarters, Peter had the rare freedom to move about with minimal supervision. Just checking the meat, he would mutter if anyone questioned his movements in the darkness. The excuse was plausible enough. Smoked meat required constant attention to prevent spoilage. On his third night working the smokehouse, Peter pocketed several strips of pork fat. Heart pounding, he approached the kennel fence. The dogs immediately began to growl, their eyes reflecting the moonlight. He stood perfectly still, speaking in low, gentle tones. "Easy now," he whispered, tossing a small piece of fat through the fence. The largest hound snapped it up, then eyed him warily. Night after night, Peter repeated this ritual. He studied how the dogs interacted, which one ate first, which yielded to others, how they responded to different tones and gestures. He noticed the pack hierarchy, how the black-spotted hound commanded respect from the others, how the smallest one compensated with fiercer barking. "You're just doing what they taught you," he murmured, one evening, crouching by the fence. Same as all of us. By the end of his first month at the smokehouse, the dogs no longer barked when Peter approached. Instead, they padded silently to the fence, ears perked forward in anticipation. When you whistled softly, a sound distinctly different from Ford's harsh commands, they tilted their heads in recognition. Sarah noticed the change first. "Those devil dogs sure quiet when you walk by," she observed one morning, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. Peter simply shrugged, but inside, the spark of hope had ignited. Where once he saw only instruments of his oppression, he now recognized potential allies. Trust was growing in the most unlikely of places, between a man fighting for dignity and the very creatures meant to deny him freedom. What some called witchcraft, Peter Williams knew was simply understanding. The enslaved smokehouse worker possessed no supernatural powers, though whispers traveled through the quarters suggesting otherwise. His gift was patience, the rarest commodity on Whitmore Plantation. "Animals speak their own language," Peter once told Sarah during a brief moment alone near the washing area. "You just need to listen differently." The bloodhounds that struck terror into the hearts of every soul on the plantation were, to Peter, creatures of habit and hierarchy. He studied their behaviors with the same careful attention he gave to the overseer's movements. Each night, Peter observed how Elias Ford commanded the pack, the sharp, authoritative whistles, the gruff tone that demanded obedience, the rewards that reinforced loyalty. In the shadows beyond the kennels, Peter practiced. His whistle began as a poor imitation of Ford's, but night after night, it evolved into something uniquely his, softer yet still commanding, a tone that promised partnership rather than domination. He carried small scraps of smoked meat in his pockets, saved from his meager rations, understanding that loyalty could be earned through consistency and reward. Rufus, the youngest hound with distinctive cinnamon-colored fur, was the first to notice Peter. The dog's ears would perk up at the smokehouse worker's approach, even before Peter made any sound. One moonless night, when the plantation lay silent under a blanket of humidity, Rufus wagged his tail at Peter's whistle, a small victory that sent a surge of hope through the man's chest. "Good boy," Peter whispered, offering a morsel through the kennel fence. That's right. Within weeks, Rufus began responding more eagerly to Peter than to Ford, a dangerous development that required careful management. The hound would turn his head toward the smokehouse, even when the overseer called, causing Ford to curse and crack his whip in frustration. "Something's wrong with that damn dog," Ford complained to the plantation manager. "Might need to be replaced." The threat only strengthened Peter's resolve. He intensified his efforts, expanding his influence to the other 5 hounds. Each dog required different approaches. The alpha needed respect, the timid one needed gentleness, the aggressive one needed firmness. Peter learned their individual personalities, adjusting his techniques accordingly. By the 3rd month, the entire pack responded to his unique whistle pattern. When Peter approached the kennels at night, 6 tails wagged in greeting. When he gave a hand signal, they sat in unison. The bond between man and beasts grew stronger with each passing night, forged through scraps of food, whispered commands, and the unspoken promise of something neither side could yet articulate. "They're ready," Peter murmured to himself one evening, watching the hounds follow his silent hand gesture to lie down. "And so am I." Whispers spread through the slave quarters like wildfire. The way Peter Williams moved among Elias Ford's bloodhounds had not gone unnoticed. Some claimed he possessed old magic from Africa, passed down through generations despite the chains that bound them. Others insisted he had made a dangerous pact with spirits that walked the Georgia swamplands at night. "That man got a touch," old Martha would say, rocking on her wooden stool. "Seen it before. Animals listen when certain folks speak, but Ford won't stand for it if he finds out." The warnings came with worried glances. Powers like these had gotten others killed before. The plantation had its own graveyard of those who'd shown too much intelligence or skill for their master's comfort. Peter tried to dismiss the talk, keeping his head down during daylight hours. But Ford had caught wind of the rumors. The overseer began changing the feeding schedule for his prized hunting pack, locking the kennels at unpredictable times, and occasionally staying late to watch the grounds himself. His suspicious eyes followed Peter whenever their paths crossed. "Something ain't right with them dogs," Ford muttered to one of the handlers. "They're getting soft. Find out who's been near them kennels after dark." The increased scrutiny forced Peter to become more cautious. He varied his routes to the smokehouse, sometimes taking unnecessarily long paths to throw off anyone who might be watching. His visits to the dogs became shorter, more hurried, though no less effective. Sarah noticed everything. With her quick eyes and quicker mind, she'd been observing Peter's movements for weeks. Unlike the others who whispered superstitions, she saw the methodical nature of his actions. One humid evening, as Peter slipped away from the smokehouse toward the kennels, a shadow detached itself from the wall behind him. "You'll get yourself killed," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned slowly to face her, weighing his options in silence. "I've watched you," she continued. "Those dogs obey you now, don't they?" The tension in Peter's shoulders didn't ease. "You planning to tell Ford?" Sarah's laugh was bitter and short. "And help that devil?" "No." She stepped closer. "But whatever you're doing, it's getting noticed. Ford's asking questions." Peter studied her face in the dim moonlight. Sarah had always kept to herself, teaching the children in secret when overseers weren't looking. She had never betrayed anyone to their knowledge. "I need those dogs," he finally admitted. "For what, I'm not sure yet, but when the time comes—" Sarah nodded slowly. "I can help. Create distractions when you need to visit them." She glanced nervously toward the main house. "Just be careful. Ford would have you whipped to death if he knew." Peter extended his hand. "Your silence means my life, and maybe all our freedom someday," Sarah replied, clasping his hand firmly. Belias Ford paced the kennel yard, his weathered face twisted in confusion. For the third time that week, his prized hounds had ignored his commands during training. The largest one, Brutus, had even growled when Ford raised his voice. "Something ain't right with these dogs," he muttered, kicking at the dirt. The overseer turned to the handler, a thin man who cowered slightly. "You been feeding them something different? Or letting someone else near them?" The handler shook his head vigorously, knowing the consequences of failure on Whitmore Plantation. Ford's suspicion hung in the humid Georgia air like the Spanish moss that draped the nearby oaks. He couldn't explain the change, but his instincts, honed through years of maintaining brutal order, told him someone was interfering with his greatest tools of control. Meanwhile, Peter Williams worked the smokehouse with practiced efficiency, his mind elsewhere. That night, a summer storm was forecast, perfect cover for his clandestine training. The rumbling thunder would mask his whistle commands and the clicking of kennel latches. Each storm was a gift, allowing him to strengthen his bond with the bloodhounds without detection. "You're playing with fire," Sarah whispered, as she passed him water at midday. Her quick eyes scanned for eavesdroppers before she continued. "Ford questioned Jeremiah about the dogs this morning. Nearly took a whip to him." Peter nodded, his face revealing nothing. "I'll be more careful, but I can't stop now." Sarah sighed but squeezed his arm in solidarity. Over the weeks since discovering his secret, she had become his most trusted ally. When Ford had nearly caught Peter returning from the kennels, she had created a distraction by knocking over a water bucket, drawing attention away from him. Another time, she had spread word that strange sounds near the dogs were likely raccoons stealing food, a simple explanation that satisfied curious ears. That evening, as lightning split the sky, Peter slipped from his cabin. Rain soaked through his thin shirt as he made his way to the kennels. The dogs whined with recognition when they caught his scent. He worked quickly, using small pieces of smoked meat to reinforce commands that contradicted Ford's. The youngest hound now responded to Peter's soft whistle by standing completely still instead of giving chase, a command that could save a runaway's life. "Good boy," Peter murmured, his fingers scratching behind the animal's ears. A branch snapped nearby. Peter froze, heart hammering against his ribs. He melted into the shadows as Ford's silhouette appeared, lantern swinging wildly against the rain. The overseer peered through the downpour, suspicion radiating from him like heat. "Who's there?" Ford called, his hand moving to the pistol at his waist. Peter remained motionless, barely breathing. The bond between him and the hounds was growing stronger each day, but so was the danger of discovery. As Ford finally turned away, Peter caught Sarah watching from the shadow of a nearby cabin, her presence a silent promise of protection. Their shared resistance was a fragile thing, but in it lay the seeds of something powerful. The breaking point came on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon. The cotton fields of Whitmore Plantation shimmered under the merciless Georgia sun. As Elias Ford's voice cut through the humid air, Sarah had merely questioned the water ration during the hottest part of the day, a reasonable concern as 2 elderly workers had already collapsed that week. "You dare question my orders?" Ford bellowed, his weathered face contorting with rage. He grabbed Sarah by the arm, dragging her to the center of the field where everyone could see. This is what happens to those who forget their place. What followed was a public humiliation so severe that even the most hardened field hands lowered their eyes. Ford tore at her headscarf, forced her to kneel in the dirt, and hurled insults that stripped away every shred of her dignity. Throughout it all, Sarah kept her back straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to break even as tears streamed down her face. Peter Williams watched from the edge of the smokehouse, his hands clenched into fists, his chest tight with a fury he dared not express. This was the woman who had covered for him countless times, who taught children to read by moonlight, who kept hope alive when others surrendered to despair. As darkness fell over the plantation, Peter slipped between the cabins, avoiding the usual patrol routes he had memorized over months of observation. When he reached Sarah's door, he knocked softly, 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. "I saw what he did," Peter whispered as he entered the small cabin. Sarah sat on her pallet, her fingers methodically rebraiding her hair, her eyes reflecting the small flame of a tallow candle. "Ford has gone too far this time. It's nothing I haven't endured before," she replied, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "We all have. And that's precisely why it must end." Peter knelt beside her, his voice dropping even lower. "I'm ready. The dogs will follow my commands now, not his." Sarah studied his face, searching for doubt, but finding only resolve. "You're certain?" "As certain as the stars above us." Peter gestured toward the window, where the waxing moon cast silver light across the plantation grounds. "Tomorrow night, when the clouds gather and the overseers drink their fill." Near the kennels, as if sensing the shift in the air, the bloodhounds began to whine softly. They paced along the fence, their noses pointed toward Sarah's cabin, toward Peter. These weren't just animals anymore. They were instruments of a justice long denied. "Then we do it," Sarah said, clasping Peter's rough hands in her own. "For all of us." Peter nodded, knowing there would be no turning back. Months of patience, of careful planning, had led to this moment. Under tomorrow's midnight moon, Elias Ford would learn that even the most powerful chains could be broken. The storm rolled across Chatham County like a warning. Lightning flashed behind thick clouds, illuminating the Whitmore Plantation in ghostly bursts as the midnight hour approached. Peter Williams crouched behind the smokehouse, his heart pounding against his ribs. The moment he had prepared for through countless nights of patience was finally here. In the dim light of his lantern, Peter dipped his hands into a wooden bucket and winced as the cold pig's blood coated his skin. He methodically slathered the dark liquid across his clothes, neck, and face, knowing the metallic scent would mask his human smell from even the keenest canine nose. This was knowledge passed down through generations, the same wisdom that had helped others survive in these woods. Thunder rumbled overhead as Peter extinguished his light and moved like a shadow across the yard. The rain began to fall, first at scattered drops, then in sheets that further obscured his movement. He approached the kennels from downwind, pausing to listen for any sign of Elias Ford or the night watchman. The bloodhounds stirred as they caught his scent, but did not bark. Months of secret training had prepared them for this moment. Peter's fingers, slick with blood and rain, worked the iron latch with practiced ease. The gate swung open with a creak that was swallowed by the storm. "Come," he whispered, then placed 2 fingers in his mouth and produced the distinctive whistle he had taught them, different from Ford's harsh command, but one they now recognized as their true master's call. Rufus emerged first, the cinnamon-colored hound's eyes reflecting the lightning. The others followed, 5 more massive dogs, bred and trained for hunting humans, now responding to Peter instead of their official master. They circled him, tails low but wagging slightly, awaiting direction. Peter led the pack across the muddy ground toward the overseer's cabin. The dogs moved in perfect formation around him, their paws silent in the wet earth. Through the rain-streaked windows, a single lamp still burned in Ford's quarters. "Now," Peter commanded softly. Gesturing toward the cabin, the dogs surged forward, powerful muscles rippling beneath wet fur. They crashed through Ford's partially open window, a coordinated wave of teeth and claws and furious barking. Inside, Elias Ford bolted upright in bed, confusion giving way to recognition as he faced his own hounds. "What in God's name?" he shouted, reaching for the whip that always hung beside his bed. The dogs growled in unison, advancing slowly, their eyes fixed on the overseer. Peter stood in the doorway, soaked in rain and blood, watching as Ford's face transformed from anger to disbelief to pure terror. The overseer's hand trembled as he raised his whip, but the dogs only snarled louder. "They don't answer to you anymore," Peter said, his voice steady despite the thunder of his pulse. With a subtle gesture from his hand, the pack inched closer to Ford, their loyalty now belonging to the man who had shown them kindness instead of cruelty. The dogs burst through Ford's open window with a cacophony of snarls and barks, their muscular bodies landing on the wooden floor with practiced precision. Elias Ford bolted upright in his bed, momentarily frozen, as 6 pairs of gleaming eyes fixed upon him in the darkness. The pack formed a semicircle around his bed, teeth bared but holding their position, not attacking, merely waiting. Outside the cabin, Peter Williams stood motionless in the shadows, his heart pounding against his ribs. The smell of pig's blood still clung to his clothes, masking his scent from any who might search for him later. He watched through the window as the overseer's face contorted from confusion to recognition and finally to pure terror. "Rufus, Brutus, down!" Ford shouted, his voice cracking. The dogs' ears twitched at the familiar commands, but they remained still, their loyalty now belonging to another master. When Peter made a subtle clicking sound with his tongue, barely audible above the storm, the cinnamon-colored Rufus took one menacing step forward, causing Ford to scramble backward until his spine pressed against the headboard. The overseer lunged for his whip, hanging on the bedpost, the same leather strap that had torn open countless backs on the Whitmore plantation. His fingers had barely grazed the handle when Peter whistled softly. The pack surged forward as one, leaping onto the bed. They didn't bite. They didn't need to. Their weight and growls were enough to pin Ford down, their hot breath on his face more terrifying than any physical wound. "Help! Someone help me!" Ford screamed, his voice carrying across the plantation grounds despite the rain. Peter slipped away as lights began appearing in nearby windows. He circled back toward the slave quarters, careful to leave no tracks in the mud. By dawn, half the plantation had heard how the mighty Elias had been found trembling in his bed, surrounded by his own hounds who refused to obey him. The overseer sported scratches on his arms and a bite on his calf, minor wounds that would heal, but his pride and authority were damaged beyond repair. They say he was crying like a child when they found him, Sarah whispered to Peter as they worked side by side the following day. Her eyes sparkled with barely concealed satisfaction. Rumors spread rapidly through Chatham County. Some claimed Ford had mistreated the animals. Others whispered that the land itself had turned against him for his cruelty. The enslaved community exchanged knowing glances, a collective understanding passing between them without words. Ford emerged from his cabin the following evening, his face haggard and his hand clutching a pistol. The bloodhounds were nowhere to be seen, having vanished into the night. The overseer's step had lost its confidence, his eyes darting nervously at every shadow. The myth of his invincibility had been shattered. And everyone, from the field hands to the house servants, could sense the shift in power. The morning after Ford's ordeal brought chaos to Whitmore Plantation. Peter Williams rose before dawn, his mind clear despite having slept barely 2 hours. He knew investigators would come, and evidence needed to be planted before the first light touched the cotton fields. Moving silently through the misty grounds, Peter scattered torn fabric from an old shirt near the kennel gates. He dragged a burlap sack soaked in deer blood through the underbrush, creating a trail leading deep into the woods that bordered the plantation. The smokehouse worker carefully placed a worn boot print in the mud, larger than his own foot, then brushed pine needles over his actual tracks. "Someone's been watching them dogs," he told the first field hand he encountered, his voice low and concerned. "Saw a stranger yesterday evening, lurking by the fence line when I was finishing up at the smokehouse." By midday, the story had spread through the quarters. Sarah, true to her quick wit, embellished the tale with just enough detail to make it convincing without being suspicious. "That man had been hanging around for days," she whispered to the cook. "Tall fellow, not from these parts." Her words carried weight. The community trusted her judgment. When 3 white men from Savannah arrived to investigate, Silas Harper led them around the property. Peter kept his distance, appearing busy with his smokehouse duties, while straining to hear their conversations. The bloodhound's disappearance puzzled everyone. Some suggested they had attacked Ford and then fled, while others believed they had been stolen. "Dogs like that are worth good money," one investigator noted, examining the broken kennel gate. The false trail Peter had created led the men on a fruitless search through the swampland. They returned mud-covered and irritated, having found nothing but the deliberately planted scraps of clothing. "Could have been runaways," another man suggested, "or someone with a grudge against Ford." The list of people with reason to hate Elias Ford was too long to narrow down suspects. The overseer himself remained bedridden, his account of the night fragmented by fear and confusion. He spoke of shadows and demons, of his own dogs turning against him like creatures possessed. Sarah caught Peter's eye across the yard as the investigators finally departed. A barely perceptible nod passed between them, acknowledgement of a dangerous victory. That evening, the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet. The absence of the bloodhounds. Howls created an eerie silence that hung over the cabins. For the first time in years, no one feared the sound of paws on the night soil. Peter sat outside his cabin, whittling a small piece of pine, his face revealing nothing of the triumph he felt inside. The Whitmore plantation had been shaken to its core, and no one suspected the quiet man who tended the smokehouse fires. The weight of decision hung heavy in the night air. Peter Williams knew the bloodhounds could not remain at Whitmore Plantation. Their newfound loyalty to him, rather than Elias Ford, would eventually be discovered, and the animals would face certain death. These creatures, once instruments of terror, had become unwitting allies in his quiet rebellion. "We need to move tonight," he whispered to Sarah, who stood guard near the smokehouse. Her eyes darted nervously toward the main house, where lantern lights still flickered in the windows. "The swamp's by the Ogeechee," she replied. "No one will follow them there." Peter nodded, gathering the meager supplies he'd hidden beneath the floorboards. Strips of salted pork and a small pouch of cornmeal. The dogs would need to hunt for themselves soon enough, but these provisions might ease their transition to freedom. As midnight approached, he slipped to the kennels. The pack recognized his footsteps. their tails wagging in silent greeting. Using his distinctive whistle, softer than Ford's harsh commands, Peter led all 6 hounds from their prison. Rufus, the cinnamon-colored dog who'd first responded to his training, took position at the front of the group. Sarah kept watch as they moved through the shadows of the cotton fields. The Georgia night enveloped them in humid darkness, the only sounds being their careful footsteps and the distant chorus of cicadas. Every few yards, Peter stopped to listen, his senses heightened by the danger of their mission. The journey to the swamps took nearly 2 hours, slowed by the need for caution. When they finally reached the edge of the Ogeechee River, the landscape transformed into a primeval world of cypress knees and Spanish moss. Water reflected the moonlight in silver patches between the trees. "This is far enough," Peter murmured, kneeling before the dogs. He ran his hands over their coats one final time, feeling the strong muscles beneath. These animals had been bred for cruelty, but would now taste wildness. "Go on," he urged, offering the last of the meat. "You're free now." The hounds hesitated, confused by the command. Rufus whined softly, pressing against Peter's leg. For a moment, the enslaved man felt his resolve waver. These creatures had become more than tools to him. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "They need to go, Peter, for their safety and ours." With a deep breath, he gave the command they'd never heard before. A sharp, forceful sound that meant, "Away." Reluctantly, the pack moved toward the swamp, looking back several times before disappearing into the moss-draped wilderness. In the weeks that followed, stories spread through the quarters. Field hands reported hearing howls from the swampland on stormy nights. Children whispered that the ghost dogs protected runaways, leading them safely through dangerous territory. The elders nodded knowingly. The instruments of oppression had become symbols of defiance. The Whitmore plantation's reign of canine terror was broken for good. The arrival of Silas Harper at Whitmore Plantation cast a new shadow over the fields. Within 3 weeks of Ford's humiliation, the wagon from Macon delivered not just a new overseer, but a different kind of tension. Harper, a lean man with calculating eyes, lacked Ford's explosive cruelty, but possessed something potentially more dangerous: methodical suspicion. "Things will run differently now," he announced on his first morning, voice carrying across the assembled workers. His gaze lingered on Peter Williams, as if some instinct had already marked the smokehouse worker for special attention. Harper instituted a system of written passes for movement between areas of the plantation and doubled the night watch. The smokehouse, once Peter's sanctuary of relative freedom, now saw regular inspections. The new overseer seemed to sense the quiet defiance that had taken root during Ford's final days. "He watches you," Sarah whispered one evening as they passed near the cotton storehouse. "Be careful." Peter nodded, his expression betraying nothing. He had become adept at appearing unremarkable, shoulders slightly stooped, eyes downcast, voice measured. The very invisibility that had once protected him now became his shield against Harper's scrutiny. The new dogs arrived with much fanfare. 4 lean hounds from a kennel known for training slave catchers' animals. Harper paraded them through the quarters, a clear message about the consequences of attempted escape. Yet something strange happened when the animals were taken to the edges of the property for training. "They won't cross the creek line," one handler complained, "just sit there howling." The dogs cowered at certain boundaries, refused to follow scent trails, and whimpered near the swamps where Peter had released Ford's pack. Some whispered that the land itself had been hexed, while others claimed the spirits of the freed hounds haunted the property lines. Harper replaced the animals twice more, with the same results. His frustration manifested in tighter restrictions, but never could he trace the problem to its source. Meanwhile, Sarah's school flourished in the shadows. 3 nights a week, in the back room of the old tool shed, she taught children their letters using charcoal on scraps of wood that could be quickly wiped clean. Peter occasionally stood watch, his ears attuned to approaching footsteps. "We must prepare them," she told him one night, her determination unwavering despite the risks, not just for reading, but for freedom when it comes. The community held its breath under Harper's rule, caught between caution and hope. Older folks counseled patience. They had survived overseers before. Younger ones whispered about the legend of the man who had turned the bloodhounds against their master. Peter moved through this uncertain time like water around stones, adapting, observing, waiting. Each evening, as he tended the smokehouse fires, he watched Harper's cabin and measured the man's routines, storing away knowledge that might someday prove useful. The midnight moon still rose over Georgia, and with it, the quiet promise of resistance. Word of Peter Williams's extraordinary feat with the bloodhounds had traveled through the whispered networks that connected plantations across the South. 2 months after Ford's humiliation, a woman appeared at the edge of the cotton fields as dusk settled over Whitmore Plantation. She moved like a shadow, her dark skin blending with the gathering night, watching Peter as he finished his duties at the smokehouse. "The dogs bow to you now," she said simply when she finally approached him. "I've heard tales from Savannah to Macon." Peter tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his knife. The woman raised her palms in a gesture of peace. "My name is Amelia Baptiste, though most know me only as Freedom," she whispered. "I help people find their way north." In the dim light, Peter could see the latticework of scars on her forearms, remnants of Louisiana sugar plantation discipline. Her eyes held the steady gaze of someone who had seen horrors, yet refused to be broken by them. "What you want with me?" Peter asked, cautiously. "Your skills could save lives." Amelia explained. "You understand scent, trails, and dogs better than anyone I've met. The slave catchers rely on hounds. You know how to confuse them." Peter shook his head. "Too dangerous. Harper watches me close. I got people here depending on me." That night, Sarah visited his cabin after hearing about the stranger. When Peter shared Amelia's proposition, Sarah's usually guarded expression softened. "Think of the children," she urged. "Some won't survive another year here. Your gift could be their only chance." For 3 nights, Peter wrestled with the decision. Helping others escape would put everyone at risk, yet remaining passive while families were torn apart had become unbearable. On the 4th night, he sought out Amelia at their arranged meeting spot near the Ogeechee River. "I'll help," he said finally, "but we do this careful, smart." Together, they began crafting escape routes through the dense Georgia pine forests. Peter taught Amelia his techniques: how to use red pepper to confuse tracking hounds, how to walk through shallow creek beds to mask scent, how to create false trails with clothing dragged in different directions. Their first success came with the Johnson family, a mother and 2 small children who vanished into the night during a summer thunderstorm. 3 weeks later, they guided the elderly Reverend Thomas to freedom, using a complex system of lantern signals and bird calls. Each successful escape strengthened their resolve, but increased the danger. Harper brought in professional slave catchers from Charleston, offering substantial rewards for captured runaways. Yet Peter's methods proved effective time after time as families disappeared like morning mist under the Georgia sun. "We're changing the tide," Amelia whispered during one midnight meeting. "Every person who reaches freedom is a victory against the whole cursed system." Peter nodded silently, knowing that while each success brought hope, it also drew them closer to discovery. The Underground Railroad was expanding beneath his feet, and there would be no turning back. The whispers of Peter Williams's exploits spread through the slave quarters like wildfire in dry brush. What began as one man's rebellion against Elias Ford had transformed into a coordinated network of escape routes stretching from the coastal marshes to the Georgia highlands. Each successful journey fueled the next, as Peter refined his techniques and expanded his circle of trusted allies. "You need to rub this mixture on your feet and clothes," Peter instructed a trembling family of 4 as they huddled in a root cellar beneath Sarah's cabin. He handed them small pouches of crushed pine needles and mud. "The scent will confuse the dogs and mask your trail." The father nodded solemnly, his eyes reflecting both terror and determination as he clutched his youngest child to his chest. Sarah kept watch outside, her quick wit their first line of defense should Harper or his men approach. Since Ford's downfall, she had become Peter's most valuable partner, her cabin serving as both classroom and way station for those seeking freedom. Each escape required meticulous planning. Peter taught runners to walk through streams, double back on their trails, and use fallen logs as bridges to leave no scent for pursuing hounds. He showed them how to read the stars, find water, and identify which plants could sustain them on their journey north. These were skills he had honed through observation and necessity, now passed on like precious heirlooms. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Peter's shoulders. For every family that disappeared into the night, dozens remained behind. He saw the hope in their eyes when they heard of successful escapes, but also the silent accusation. When will it be our turn? Some nights, he could barely sleep, haunted by the faces of those he couldn't yet help. Amelia Baptiste arrived more frequently now, bringing news from other plantations and towns. "Your methods are spreading," she told Peter during a clandestine meeting by the Ogeechee River. "People as far as Macon are using animal scents to throw off slave catchers." Her scarred hands gripped his with unexpected strength. "You've given them more than freedom. You've given them tools." The network's growth brought increased danger. Slave patrols doubled their efforts, and bounties for captured runaways increased. Harper grew more suspicious with each disappearance, implementing curfews and random cabin searches. Yet somehow, the flow continued. One family, then another, vanishing like morning mist. Peter knew their time was growing short. Each success left fewer places to hide, fewer excuses to explain absences. Still, he couldn't stop. The movement had taken on a life beyond him now, a current that flowed through the darkest corners of Georgia, carrying with it the most precious cargo, hope. The night was thick with fog when Peter Williams led the small girl through the tangled undergrowth beside the Ogeechee River. Leela couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her tiny hand trembling in his as they waded through shallow water to mask their scent. The child hadn't spoken a word since they'd left the plantation 3 nights prior, but her eyes, wide and watchful, missed nothing. "Almost there," Peter whispered, pointing to the faint lantern light ahead, where Amelia waited with a wagon. The conductor's face was half hidden beneath her hood, but her smile broke through the darkness as they approached. "You made it," she breathed, quickly lifting Lila into the hidden compartment beneath the wagon's false floor. "Any trouble?" Peter shook his head. "Harper's new dogs still won't track. They caught our scent at the creek, but turned back." A small victory that still brought a smile to his face. 2 months passed before Sarah brought the news during their clandestine meeting behind the smokehouse. "That little girl you helped, she reached New York." Her voice dropped even lower. "Turns out she's Susan Alcott's niece, the abolitionist writer." The revelation struck Peter like lightning. Lila had been sold south after her mother died, separated from her northern relatives who'd been searching for her for years. Now, the connection to such a prominent abolitionist was both blessing and curse. Within weeks, coded messages arrived from New York. Susan Alcott was mobilizing resources. Money, supplies, and safe houses were being established along new routes. Peter's network suddenly had backing from wealthy northern sympathizers who'd been moved by Lila's story and Peter's courage. "They want to help more families escape," Amelia explained during her next visit, passing him a small pouch of coins. "This will buy medicine, food for the journey." But with increased support came heightened danger. Slave catchers from as far as Virginia appeared in Chatham County, drawn by rumors and rewards. Harper began inviting strangers to dinner at the main house, men with hard eyes who asked too many questions about the plantation's routines. One evening, Peter noticed unfamiliar boot prints near the smokehouse door. Someone had been watching him. "We need to be more careful," he warned Sarah as they sorted through a bundle of supplies Amelia had left. "They're paying attention now." Sarah nodded, her quick eyes scanning the darkness beyond the cabin window. "The children say there's a new man in town asking questions about you specifically." Peter felt the weight of responsibility pressing down. Every person he helped reach freedom put those left behind at greater risk. He thought of Lila, safe in New York, and of the dozens still waiting for their chance. The path forward was narrowing, but there was no turning back. "Tell Amelia we need to change our routes," he said finally, "and warn everyone, every victory makes us more vulnerable." The betrayal came without warning. Peter Williams had just finished mapping a new escape route through the marshlands when Jeremiah, a young man he'd trusted with minor tasks, disappeared. 2 days later, slave catchers swarmed the eastern edge of the plantation, exactly where 3 families had been scheduled to meet their guide. Someone talked. Amelia whispered, her face drawn with worry as she met Peter behind the smokehouse. They knew exactly where to look. Peter nodded grimly. The betrayal cut deep, but there was no time for anger. "We need to move the Taylors tonight instead. Different route." But as they spoke, lantern light flickered at the edge of the property. Silas Harper was leading a group of men toward the cabins, their silhouettes menacing against the twilight sky. Peter knew immediately what was happening. A surprise inspection. "They're looking for me," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Amelia gripped his arm. "Then disappear. I'll warn Sarah." But Peter shook his head. If he vanished now, suspicion would fall on everyone connected to him. The entire network would crumble under Harper's scrutiny. In that moment, he made his decision. "Tell Sarah I'm sorry," he said, then stepped into the open. What followed was a performance worthy of any theater. Peter stumbled toward the main house, pretending to be disoriented. When Harper's men spotted him, he ran, but not too fast, not too cleverly. He allowed himself to be cornered, to be captured. "Found him trying to run, Mr. Harper," one man called, shoving Peter to his knees. The overseer circled him slowly. "Been hearing interesting things about you, boy." Peter hung his head, playing the part of the defeated runaway while his mind raced. Every moment they focused on him was another moment the families had to escape. Every question directed at him was one not asked of Sarah or the others. The beating that followed was brutal, but expected. What Peter hadn't anticipated was being locked in the root cellar rather than the plantation jail. Harper wanted him isolated, away from other enslaved people who might help him. For 3 days, Peter drifted between consciousness and darkness. Then, on the 3rd night, he heard the soft scrape of metal against wood. The cellar door opened, revealing Amelia's determined face, with Sarah and 2 men Peter recognized from neighboring plantations standing behind her. "You foolish, brave man," Sarah whispered, helping him to his feet. "Half the Underground Railroad came to get you out." Amelia handed him a waterskin. "The Taylors made it to the Savannah safe house. Your sacrifice bought them freedom." As they helped him through the darkness, Peter's body ached with every step, but his resolve had never been stronger. The betrayal had cost him dearly, but it had failed to break the most important bonds, those forged in resistance and hope. "We keep going," he whispered through cracked lips, "all the way to freedom." The skies above Whitmore Plantation had been threatening all day, dark clouds gathering like bruises across the horizon. Peter Williams knew the signs. This would be no ordinary storm. After 3 years of careful planning and countless risks taken, his instincts told him tonight was his last chance. Silas Harper had been watching him too closely, asking questions about missing supplies, interrogating others about Peter's movements. "They're closing in," Sarah whispered during their brief meeting behind the tool shed. Her eyes, usually bright with defiance, now shimmered with worry. Harper's bringing in men from Savannah tomorrow. Professional slave catchers with new dogs. Peter nodded, squeezing her hand. Then I go tonight. The first thunderclap shook the plantation just after sunset. By nightfall, the storm had unleashed its fury, rain hammering the wooden cabins, lightning illuminating the cotton fields in ghostly flashes. The conditions were perfect. No dog could track a scent in this downpour, and Harper's men would seek shelter rather than patrol. In the smokehouse, Peter gathered his meager provisions: a small knife, strips of dried meat, a flint for fire starting. He'd memorized Amelia's instructions about the safe house 20 miles north. The timing had to be precise. He rubbed himself with a mixture of red clay and crushed herbs, a trick learned from an elder who'd escaped and returned to guide others. The concoction would mask his scent long after the rain stopped. With one final look at the smokehouse that had been both his prison and his sanctuary, he slipped into the tempest. The plantation grounds had transformed into shallow streams, mud pulling at his feet as he navigated by memory and instinct. Twice he froze as lantern lights swept nearby, Harper's men making half-hearted rounds. Each time, the darkness swallowed him again. Near the edge of the property, a figure emerged from behind a massive oak. Sarah stood drenched, a small bundle clutched to her chest. "For your journey," she said, pressing it into his hands. Inside was cornbread, a small pouch of seeds, and a carved wooden bird, a symbol of freedom crafted by one of her students. "Come with me," Peter urged, though he knew her answer. "My place is here," she replied, her voice steady despite her tears. "The children need me, but you must go. Show them it can be done." They embraced briefly, rain mingling with their tears. No words could capture what they'd shared or what they'd sacrificed. With a final nod, Peter turned toward the swamps that bordered the Ogeechee River. Behind him, Sarah watched until his silhouette disappeared into the storm-lashed night. The plantation would awaken tomorrow to find him gone, another soul vanished into legend. Harper would rage and search, but the land itself seemed to conspire with Peter, washing away every trace of his passage under the midnight moon. Peter Williams moved like a shadow across the Georgia countryside, his senses heightened to every snap of twigs and distant bark. Slave catchers with their fresh hounds patrolled the roads, making each step of his northward journey a dance with death. The weight of freedom felt both exhilarating and terrifying as he navigated by stars and whispered directions. "Keep to the creek bed for 3 miles," an elderly woman had instructed at his first safe house, pressing a small pouch of herbs into his palm. "Crush these leaves on your feet. Dogs hate the scent." The Underground Railroad operated like an invisible thread, pulling him northward. Peter crossed the Savannah River on a moonless night, lying flat in a small fishing boat guided by a silent ferryman whose face remained hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The water's gentle lapping against the wooden hull was the only sound marking their passage from Georgia to South Carolina. Each safe house brought new faces: a Quaker family in a modest farmhouse, a free black blacksmith with a hidden cellar, a white widow whose husband had once been an abolitionist. They offered food, rest, and precious information about patrols ahead. Peter memorized their coded language. Packages meant people, conductors were guides, and stations were hiding places. "You're the dog man from Chatham County," whispered a conductor in North Carolina, recognition lighting his eyes. "Stories about you reached us months ago." Peter neither confirmed nor denied, but during his brief stays, he shared what he knew. He taught fellow fugitives how to mask their scent with pine needles and mud, how to walk backward to confuse tracking hounds, and how to read the natural world for guidance. "Water always runs north to south," he explained to a terrified young couple at a safe house near the Virginia border. "Follow it upstream when lost." The journey took nearly 2 months. Sometimes Peter traveled with others. More often, he moved alone. He learned to sleep in short bursts, to forage for food when supplies ran low, and to trust his instincts about which strangers might offer help versus harm. Near the Ohio border, a close call nearly ended his bid for freedom. A patrol spotted him crossing an open field at dawn. Peter dove into a thicket of brambles, pressing himself into the earth as horses thundered past. He remained motionless for hours, blood from thorn scratches drying on his skin, until a railroad conductor found him at dusk. "You're almost there," the man whispered, helping Peter to his feet. "One more river to cross, and you'll stand on free soil." That night, as he gazed across the Ohio River toward the northern shore, Peter thought of Sarah and the community he'd left behind. Their faces remained etched in his memory, reminders of why each painful step of this journey mattered, and why his story must continue. Peter Williams stepped off the wagon into the crisp autumn air of Buxton, Ontario, his breath forming small clouds in front of him. The settlement, established as a haven for those who had escaped bondage, stretched before him with its neat rows of wooden houses and bustling community center. After months of perilous travel along the Underground Railroad, dodging slave catchers and surviving on little more than courage and the kindness of strangers, he had finally reached free soil. The Canadian winter arrived with a ferocity that Peter had never experienced in Georgia. Snow piled high against doorways, and winds cut through even the thickest clothing. Yet each morning, as he trudged through knee-deep drifts toward his newly established blacksmith shop, he felt a lightness in his chest. The bitter cold was a small price for the sweetness of freedom. "You'll get used to it," laughed Ezra Johnson, an older man who had escaped from Charleston 5 years earlier. "First winter nearly sent me running back south. Now I can't imagine living anywhere else." The blacksmith shop became Peter's sanctuary. He had learned the basics of metalwork on the Whitmore plantation, but here he could develop his craft without limitation. The rhythmic clang of his hammer against the anvil became a meditation, each strike transforming raw metal into tools, horseshoes, and household items. Local farmers, both black and white, sought his services, impressed by his meticulous work and fair prices. In the evenings, the black community gathered in the settlement's church hall. There, Peter found kinship with others who carried similar scars, both visible and invisible. He met families from Louisiana, Virginia, and the Carolinas, each with their own harrowing tales of escape. Among them was a woman named Martha, whose quiet strength and warm laugh reminded him of Sarah. Their friendship blossomed slowly, healing parts of his heart he thought would remain forever broken. Peter wrote letters to Amelia Baptiste when safe couriers traveled south, sending coded messages about his new life and inquiring after those left behind. News eventually reached him that Sarah's underground school continued to flourish, now with additional support from Northern abolitionists. "You've built something remarkable," Martha told him one evening as they walked home from a community meeting. The northern lights danced above them, painting the sky in ethereal greens and purples. "We all have," Peter replied, looking around at the settlement. "Every person here carries a piece of those we left behind." In Buxton, Peter found not just safety, but purpose. The Canadian pound jingled in his pocket, money he had earned through his own labor, to spend as he chose. At night, he slept without fear of bloodhounds or overseers. And each morning, he woke to possibilities that had once seemed as distant as the stars. Decades after Peter Williams vanished from the Whitmore plantation, his legend still whispered through the pine forests of Georgia. Around crackling fires in hidden clearings, and in hushed tones within whitewashed church halls, his story grew with each telling. The enslaved man who turned the instruments of oppression into tools of liberation. Children sat wide-eyed as elders recounted how Peter had befriended the very bloodhounds meant to hunt their kind, how he had used patience and understanding where others saw only fear. Some claimed the descendants of those freed dogs still roam the swamplands near the Ogeechee River, refusing to serve any master. Hunters spoke of encountering packs that would watch from a distance, but never approach, as if carrying the memory of a different allegiance in their blood. Back on the plantation, Sarah's underground school flourished in the shadows. She taught not only letters and numbers, but wove Peter's story into lessons of quiet resistance. "Remember," she would tell the children, "Peter didn't have weapons or armies. He had patience and wisdom." The woman's quick wit had saved her many times from Silas Harper's suspicions, allowing her to nurture a generation who understood that freedom began in the mind long before it reached the body. In Buxton, Peter's blacksmith shop became a gathering place for the formerly enslaved. The rhythmic clanging of his hammer punctuated stories shared by those who had followed his path north. Though his hands grew calloused from the forge, they remained gentle when greeting newcomers who arrived with nothing but hope. He never spoke of himself as special, insisting that courage lived in everyone who survived another day under bondage. Amelia Baptiste continued her work with the Underground Railroad, using techniques Peter had taught her. The conductor incorporated his methods of false trails and scent confusion into her operations, saving countless lives. When she occasionally visited Buxton, their conversations would last until dawn, planning and remembering in equal measure. Word reached them when Elias Ford died, a broken man still jumping at shadows and the distant howl of dogs. The overseer had never recovered from the night his power was inverted, when the creatures he trusted turned against him. His death brought no celebration, only quiet acknowledgement that one chapter had closed. Peter's greatest legacy wasn't the dramatic night of reckoning or even his escape. It was the ripple effect of possibility, the knowledge that systems of oppression contained their own weaknesses. Under the same midnight moon that had witnessed his boldest acts, new stories of resistance were being written across the South, each one carrying a trace of the smokehouse worker who had dared to reimagine the boundaries of the possible.